stream. And yeah, with this one we're going to start out by entering in our stuff in the chat with the Patreon. For those who don't know, we can they can donate to my Patreon just by clicking on that link. It brings them to my Patreon. It's also in the bottom of the chat, or bottom in the bottom in the it's in the chat and the bottom of the description of the live of this live stream. And that'll kind of give you some information that I'm on disability, and it goes toward other things as well. And with this, it's going to kind of go into a few different things and show people kind of how they can go and help aid the channel. And because I'm not yet at the level of where I can make money on it. Now, in addition to this, we're going to go into the topics. First we're going to go into the Thomas Massie John Kerry exchange. Now, for those unfamiliar with this, you need to understand a little bit about each. Now, first we're going to go into John Kerry. Now, John Kerry, you should be familiar with him, that he's notorious for flying in personal jets across the U.S., basically just as much as people like Al Gore, preaching about climate change but not actually living under what he preaches. And this should be a very big key to the way he's actually living. And when it comes down to it, what people should know is that his experience is not as a scientist. So when anything that he states should be taken with a grain of sand, he's merely parroting everything that he's been told to state, and he does not actually know anything that he is stating. And it is not coming out as actual legitimate fact, merely that he is actually nothing more than a political mouthpiece for whatever he's been told to state. And this is something which is very, very key to what's actually going on. He's merely nothing more than the political mouthpiece for this big state type of project for what certain ones are believing in this global warming catastrophe, and if we don't do something, the whole world's going to end. This basic sky is falling type of mentality. Now, on the other side, you have Thomas Massie. Now, one thing to know about Thomas Massie, he's been referred to as the greenest member of Congress. Now, right there is John Kerry is at a huge disadvantage. Number two is Thomas Massie is also mechanical engineer trained at MIT. And that's another thing. He is an actual legitimate scientist. He has different patents with the patent office as well, which shows that he's actually been productive with doing something under science as well. This is not something like Bill Nye, where Bill Nye has an engineering degree but did not actually do anything with it, and instead went into acting. And that's one thing people don't know about Bill Nye. Bill Nye is actually merely just putting things out as acting. He does not actually put forth anything with his degree. He actually is most likely has forgotten a lot of aspects of his degree, because he's actually been a long time since his degree. He actually put forth the way he applied it was he went directly from his degree and then went directly into acting since that point. So he essentially has kind of tossed off his degree to begin with, and he would have then forgotten a lot of his aspects, so he didn't even put his degree to use. He felt, in his original show, he felt kind of put some basic things of science into his show, and that was kind of the way his original show was structured. But if you looked at what he's done since then, it's been completely off the wall. And this is what you should have seen from him. So believing anything that he states should be taken with a grain of sand, because, or a grain of salt, I should say. Sorry, a grain of salt, because the fact is he's never put anything to use with that degree, and that's just a bachelor's degree. It's you considered quite low, and with that, and you can't really do much with that from that point. Now, what Thomas Massie has is a master's degree, which is a much higher level thing. He's able to actually pursue much higher end projects with that, and has a greater knowledge in what he's talking about when talking about scientific ideas. And it's even come, Thomas Massie was even one to state that on the actual floor, when we had, who was it? I believe it was, I don't know if it was Macron or if it was, no, I believe it was, I believe it was actually Justin Trudeau. I believe that's who it was, and he went on to actually go on this whole big diatribe on climate change. I believe it was him. I don't believe it was Macron. It may have been Macron, but it was basically where, but I believe it was Trudeau, and what Massie went on the next day with it on the actual, this is on the floor of Congress. On the next day with it, Massie actually went on and explained where they actually went wrong, because what they were doing, they were what the usual other leaders go and they basically state these kind of outlandish points. Now Massie actually showed, just through the basic ideas of photosynthesis, how actually things work. Is he actually explained it even through the actual math equations of how plants take in CO2 and they give off O2, which is they're actually looking for carbon, which is actually that's how plants grow, and carbon is actually necessary for the growth of plants. Doesn't matter what plant we're talking about. And this was a major thing in which Massie has actually made in stating points. Now, what was happening on this specific exchange was that John Kerry was trying to state a specific thing of saying, well, the amount of CO2 has never been higher with and you're stating a specific number of years. Well, this is only within the time of humans being on Earth. Well, he was, Thomas Massie goes, well, what about before that point? Well, that was caused by geologic change. And this is a point where Thomas Massie then replies, well, has geologic change stopped since that point? And John Kerry had to admit that no, because we know that this is an actual point that geologic change does not stop, and it's an ever continuing process because of just the way that the Earth is made. Every planet, basically, under the actual crust, you actually have the magma that's under it. Every time the magma basically moves, it's going to basically create geologic change. and if it moves to the surface, it creates the lava, which that's geologic change there, and that's going to allow CO2 as well as other chemicals to come, other chemical compositions to come up to the surface, and then if creating lava. And once it reaches the surface, and then you'll also have the case of if it only creates gas at the surface, that's going to again, that can create different things such as earthquakes and such through the actual pressure. Now this is where you actually get geologic change. And this should be actually very, very important to what people are understanding. And people need to grasp the idea that this is what was being discussed. And people need to understand that when we actually deal with these things, this is how, this is what actually is happening. Now, this is not, this did not actually cease occurring just because humans stepped on Earth and were and evolved at that point. That's not what actually occurred. That geologic change doesn't stop; it continues through. Now, this means that if that was the case, then what would have actually had to have occurred, since we know that the CO2 levels were actually higher at that point, that means that since humans have been here, that CO2 levels of human interaction would have actually had to have been at lower amounts, because we know that the interaction with the geologic change are actually higher. So the actual point would actually mean that this is actually not a point to actually argue. We know that temperatures on the actual Earth throughout time have actually been hotter through the whole region of the Earth, and that's actually a point. There's actually never been global flooding beyond through biblical stories, but there's actually never been cases of that we can actually prove of global flooding. And because we know that there's other reasons why species die off, and it's because of temperature change, because there was actually ice age. There was actually an ice age that actually changed this. So it was actually we've actually shown that it's not actually warming that actually causes problems in species. It's actually the cooling that actually causes it. Warming actually causes the development of more plants and such, because you're not going to get what we are finding throughout history is you're not going to get warmer at the equator. Even if we actually look at the numbers that we're actually seeing around the equator, if you go closer and closer to the equator, their actual top temperatures are no higher, are actually not higher. Just their averages are higher. What's actually where we're actually noticing higher peaks are actually in temperate climates. Now that this is actually a normal occurrence, and of what we actually see, and that this is actually normally what occurs. You get these peaked. That's where you're getting these peak temperatures. Now if we were to get these, more extreme temperatures like what they get in the tropical regions throughout the whole Earth, you know that these you would drop off those extreme peaks of those temperatures. It's not just going to be a slide up in temperature and you're going to get higher peaks. That's not how the system works, because we can see the way it works near in these rainforest areas, that when we look at the most extreme temperatures, they don't essentially when we look at their temperatures are not hotter. And this is a major point that needs to be brought up. And it's something that's very, very important. And we need to understand this. And this is something that's that needs to be understood when looking at what was going on in the exchange. Why, when we get people that, from the aspect of John Kerry, why it goes into something very, why he was essentially quoting pseudoscience. And this is a major point that needs to be understood. And this is something that we need to grasp. And someone like John Kerry needs to basically understand that temperatures don't just go up in a sliding scale. That even if they were to, even if temperatures were to rise, the worst that would happen is we would become essentially a global rainforest, which would not exactly be a bad thing. This would mean that all societies around the globe would have 12 months of food production. This would mean that the cases of starvation around the globe would actually be minimalized. And the worst case scenario would basically be that you would have the warming of the oceans, which would which would be the next case thing. And it would, that would actually happen at a very slow rate because the density of the oceans. And it would be similar to what would be available in the southern, in the waters near the like the South Pacific, and it would be similar to what we'd see there. And as opposed to what we're seeing in like the North Pacific or North Atlantic waters for those of us in America, or those of us in Europe. And when we look at that, this is where they actually go horribly wrong with their numbers. This is why when we look at those things where they're saying, "Oh, there's going to be this huge disaster," well, the fact is we're not going to have this, because the fact is it's not just basically going to the polar ice caps, if they were to melt, they're not just going to pour over people. And currently with it, our actual trends are showing that we would be more likely to be in a global cooling phase than a global warming phase, which is actually would be more detrimental to society than anything else. Though it depends on how much cooling we're actually talking about. And we know that this has zero impact of carbon, because when we look at carbon, there's no actual linkage between that and temperature. If we actually look at if we can actually graph it out, because because if you go back to reports in the 70s, they were thinking cooling. Google back reports in the 80s, they're thinking it was warming. 90s, they were thinking it was warming, and now they're going back to potential ideas of cooling. So when we start to look at this, we can actually see that it doesn't really fit to any specific point, that it could be anything. So they know that carbon is not linked to anything specifically, and it can't. It would have to be one specific phenomena. That's why when we had the exchange, this is why Massie called them out for quoting pseudoscience specifically in that word, is because of there's no actual legitimate evidence. And what Kerry's basically doing is pushing for another big government takeover in the way people live their lives. And we know that there is no legitimate evidence for it. Now, could we actually do something that could actually help people live more efficiently? Yes, we could with it, but we'd have to start taking some of the ideas of what Thomas Massie has done and see if he could not help it. He would be the one to ask, not these other morons who are basically career politicians. You would want to ask someone like him, and you don't want to ask someone who basically has no experience in any of this. Now, going on to the next part is we want to go beyond this and go to the second story, which is about Colonel Johnny Barr basically noticing that the Russiagate was basically started on the spying in the first place, and it basically brings up the story of domestic spying again, and this is what basically it brings, and it's all coming from the civilian intelligence, basically NSA, FBI, CIA, and working through the FISA system. Now we keep bringing this back up again. Now, what to do about them? And this keeps and when people say, "Oh, we can do reform," well, we've tried that through so many different points. And what we realize is reform just makes it worse. And what we need to do is get to the idea of what this actually really means. Reform only makes it worse in the long run, and we need to realize that what to actually do about them is to eliminate them. And people are going to say, "Oh, but then we won't have any intelligence." Actually, that would be an actual lie, because we actually have military intelligence. Now, the difference between military intelligence and civilian intelligence is, number one, military intelligence cannot spy on people domestically. The reason why is because you'll actually find this funny is because military intelligence actually takes an oath to the Constitution. The Constitution specifically guards against domestic spying. Now, this is where it actually gets kind of funny, because technically if you have an agency that's taking an oath to the Constitution, that actually is where they get prohibited. And that shows you why civilian intelligence is troublesome to begin with, and why we don't need it. If they're not taking an oath to the Constitution, what are they taking an oath to? Well, they're only taking an oath to secrecy. And that means that and they believe that anybody who actually has an actual personal oath to the Constitution within their ranks is considered troublesome. That was their problem with Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden did not, he was working with a contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton. They felt that he was troublesome because he was essentially not going along with the oath to secrecy. They felt that oath to that personal oath to the Constitution was just really troublesome, and that's why they wanted to basically hang him. They feel that that's very, very troublesome, and that's why when you get to the things like the CIA will actually use that. They like using ideas of torture and black sites. Now, we obviously know that torture is illegal. Number one, you cannot do it to a U.S. citizen, but you can actually do it if you actually make it on a black site. This is a site off the U.S. Property and U.S. territories, and this means you can torture people all you want. Now, does torture actually work? We actually know that torture does not. Torture has never actually worked because they'll actually give you false information to actually make the torture stop. When it comes down to the NSA, they're just collecting just massive amounts of data. They're actually abusing the data that actually comes in, and they've actually reports have actually shown that they have never stopped one person. Well, the fact is this means that the NSA as an actual department is a complete waste of money, and that their spying grid can actually spy on all these other countries. Well, the fact is when we're talking about international relations, this is not a good way to go about it. And the best way to go about it is actually for other countries to feel comfortable with you. And if we're using the NSA to spy on our own leaders, to spy on leaders of other countries, that's not a way that they can actually sit into a meeting and feel comfortable. They know they don't want to actually be sitting down and realize that they can actually be spied on at any specific moment, where they can't trust anybody in that room. Because if one person actually has a cell phone on them, or any piece of electronics on them, or there's or there could be even general types of pieces of electronics in the room that could actually be taping them, and that's an actual problem. And they've been able to find ways to get these types of electronics in almost anything. And they've been using, if you look at such as the CIA is actually, we've had declassified things that actually show just to spy on people. They put radio antennas in cats. I mean, then this goes back to the 1970s, and this is to spy on the Soviet Union in their embassy, and this should show you that how insane our civilian intelligence is. And yes, the cat ended up getting run over, but the fact is when we start looking at it, is we should start realizing what the actual impact is. And we should basically realize that and then basically, if you want to go with the actual cost with it, it was, I believe it was 73 was when they did it, and it was about $8,000. So if you go in today's amount, that would be spending over about $45,000. Now this is just one cat, I believe, and that's like spending $45,000. Now you might go, oh, it's only a little over $45,000. Well, in today's money, well, the fact is that's a lot of and that's just based on the US's inflation rates. It's probably even more if we actually go with the alternative inflation rates. It's probably much higher than that. And but it still shows you how much they would actually waste. Now, if they would have, we've done stupid things like to attack Cuba, an army of attack dolphins. Now, if we're wasting money like this, and we're willing to do these type of crazy things, it shows you how awful and how basically crazy we have people in our civilian intelligence, and that this has been an ongoing problem for many, many years. And they're willing to, and it's basically, it basically takes in many, many crazy people, and this system is basically self-replicating its craziness, and it's not going to end, and you're not going to stop it just by doing some reforms, because you can do all the reforms you want, and you could tell them to stop, and they're just going to blow it off, and that's the whole problem. And this is what needs to be understood: is you could say stop it immediately, and you could say cease and desist all these programs. Well, what they're going to do, they're going to make up more programs, and they're basically going to keep violating any type of order you put through. That's why when these people have said they were appalled by these people like Devin Nunes have said, "Oh my God, I'm appalled that they're spying on the president." Well, he said this basically, after he had all the information of spying, yet of all this domestic spying, yet he fully endorsed the reauthorization of FISA. Well, this means he must have been very, very disingenuous, because when it comes down to the FISA reapplication, he doesn't really seem to be that serious about it. And when we're talking about people like that with it, it seems that he's not that serious when it comes down to that. He just wanted to make himself look like he was actually doing something, and make himself look good in front of the president. That was merely what that was, and that's of basically showing up there, because he's not even really serious about any of this. Because if he really was, he would have actually opposed the FISA reauthorization, and would have actually said, okay, this thing is only being used for number one, political purposes, number two, to spy on people domestically, number three, it's never been used for any good, and the NSA has never caught anybody. So what we're going to do is we're not going to reauthorize any of it, and we're basically going to tell them to get a legitimate Fourth Amendment warrant if they want anybody, and if they want, and they need to get individual warrants and basically make them go through those hoops, and that would have stopped all of this bulk collection and of any type of data. And the fact is, we know that they're at least doing it on some level, and but the fact is, they're never going to admit that to Congress. That's why they only give a few people the information of what they're doing, because they and those people are usually, when we look at it, those people are usually the ones with the lowest scores for upholding the Constitution. They want to make sure of that, because if they were higher scores for upholding the Constitution, their agency would be shut down immediately, and that's the whole point. They want to make sure these people that are basically privy to the most knowledge are given the least amount of are the lowest scores for actually upholding the Constitution, because you want to basically the ones who get the least amount of knowledge are going to be the ones that uphold the most amount of constitutional liberty. You want to make sure of that, because if you get a guy like Rand Paul, you don't want to give it's in their best interest not to give people like Rand Paul, people like Thomas Massie, access to a lot of information for information on intelligence, because you know damn well that they're basically going to say, we need to shut this stuff down immediately. And you definitely don't want to do intelligence information over everyone, which would actually have a representative system, as the founders instructed the United States to have, because if they were to do that, then all of these civilian intelligence agencies would be immediately shut down, instead of just trying to hear limited bits and pieces from the people who are actually privy to this little bit of knowledge, which is usually just only a couple of people in each chamber. And those people are going to basically be horrible when it comes to upholding the Constitution. And what to do about this is, we basically just need to say bye-bye to these organizations, because with them still sitting there, they're never going to respect the Constitution. This is, and we need to view it as all of them, all civilian intelligence. Civilian intelligence does not have any respect for it. And we need to understand that civilian intelligence was created in the 20th century. This means that civilian intelligence was not an actual creation that was actually set up by the actual founders, and it means that we never even needed to begin with, because we know that terrorism goes back to the 1st century AD. So we know that terrorism predates it, so we know that it isn't effective. We know that crime goes back as early as man goes back, so we don't need the FBI. And we already have a Justice Department as well to prosecute federal crimes, so we don't need an FBI. And that means that we can actually get rid of all of this. And I think you don't even need any of that stuff, and then you could basically trim it down. And there's many other agencies you can trim down as well, but that's really for another video discussion. And when we get down to that, and I believe I've gone over that before, of agencies that we can flat out eliminate. And when we start viewing this in such a way that of just eliminating these agencies, you'll basically view that it's going to be a lot better for people. And it's going to be a lot better for the way that people can actually live. Because when we start talking about what these agencies actually do, well, they don't actually do any functions that are legitimate. People go, oh, but the FBI is catch criminals. Well, frankly, we have local divisions within each state that do that. We also have, from the actual federal level, we have the Department of Justice. That's their job. We don't need an actual additional department on top of that. We have the CIA. The CIA is basically stepping on the feet of military intelligence. We have every division of the military has their own intelligence, and they basically have a function of putting the Constitution first before anything else. Constitution before secrecy, which is a very, very important thing. And once you realize that, you'll realize that there is no actual function. And basically what these other civilian agencies end up doing is they end up pushing our foreign policy to intervention. And that's really what they're functioning as. It's through intervention and through basically spying domestically on citizens. And really, it's basically goes completely away from what the founders had instructed us to do. And once you eliminate that, you're going to see that that's going to get us back to what we need to be. And I'm probably just going to cut it off right here. If you like it, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share it all the way around. Make sure that if you can't donate to my Patreon page, make sure that you share it around to someone else who can. And I will see you guys later, hopefully. Bye, everyone.